So as you know, industrial food systems tend to move away from diversity and towards uniformity. And the next slide. And this diversity and uniformity can have a lot of different attributes, not only on the farm, but also off the farm. So I've listed a number of these here, and I've highlighted ownership because when fewer and fewer firms control more of the food supply, not only does that reduce ownership diversity, but it means decision-making is concentrated in fewer hands. It's less democratic. So most of my research has focused on this, but I'm interested in all of these. And I'm going to be talking more about this as we go on. So next slide. And as you know, when we have uniformity, it can be a real problem. So just a few examples. Uniformity in corn or maize in 1970 contributed to corn blight in the US and Canada. And then we have a lot of uniformity in livestock, which has contributed to recent epidemics of avian influenza, which we've seen in turkeys and chickens all over the world. Next slide. And this concentration of ownership and geographic concentration, that uniformity has contributed to supply disruptions like we saw in the wake of COVID when processing plants were shut down due to outbreaks of COVID. The next slide. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to be focusing on the systems that supply us with grain and products that contain grain. And because these systems are so complicated, I'm just going to focus on a few areas. Next one. Bread, beer, milling, farming, and seeds. And so I'm not going to talk about distribution and retail and international grain trade, all of which are also experiencing these trends. So next slide. So we have this dominant trend of fewer and larger firms taking over markets, industries, but these trends are also resisted. So you have efforts to create more diversity. But the dynamic that's really interesting is some of those efforts to create more diversity actually become so successful that they attract the interest of this very uniform system, these dominant firms, so that they end up either copying some of those strategies or even, next slide, acquiring some of the most successful efforts to fill those spaces that these big firms have left behind. And so this ends up, in some ways, even reinforcing these trends. The next slide. So here's an example. This is from The Onion, so this is satire. This isn't real, but it says, Omni-grain Cheerios made with every existing grain on earth. And then next slide, this is what inspired it. This is a real product, Cheerios with ancient grains. And so this is a product that has Kamut Khorasan, brand Khorasan wheat, spelt, and then also quinoa. And they were quickly followed by Kellogg's, which introduced their Origins breakfast cereal with the same three ingredients. And a marketing manager actually explained the motivation for this. I mean, you might think, well, is Kellogg really interested in improving the diversity of grain systems, or are they thinking about the health benefits of eating these products? Well, this marketing manager clarified it on the next slide. Because they were criticized for the high sugar content for the cereal. And he explained they simply wanted to capitalize on the ancient grains trend while also making it taste good, hence the added sugar. So clearly, there aren't any deeper values behind what they're doing here. And the next slide. So let's look a little more in depth at those 5 segments that I introduced. So starting with bread, this is the Wonder Bread. It was created by Continental Baking Company, and it contributed to a really dramatic transformation in bread in the US. So from the 1890s to the 1930s, at the beginning of that period, about 90% of bread was homemade and made mostly by women. By the end of that period, 90% was made in factories and made mostly by men. So a key player was a guy who he first acquired Continental Baking, and then using funding and strategies from steel barons, tried to create a bread trust. So he eventually acquired 3 different very large baking companies and then tried to merge them all together. But by that time, the antitrust movement was gaining a little more steam, and President Coolidge at the time would only allow a duopoly, not a monopoly on bread. So that fell apart. And the next slide. So, but today the situation really isn't much different. We have 2 firms that control half the market for bread in the US. And then 4 firms together control 58% of the market. And so in other words, we have a Coke and Pepsi of bread. But we don't really see that in the supermarket aisles. Next slide. Because these firms have dozens and dozens of brands. And so most people will go down the aisles and not look closely at the fine print on who actually owns that brand, and it looks like you have all these choices. So yeah, Bimbo Bakeries is actually a multinational corporation. They're headquartered in Mexico, and they have over 100 brands worldwide, including all these bread brands in the US. And they also have brands for other products. And then the next slide is Flowers Foods, which is focused more on the US, but 24 brands, as well as additional brands for snacks and tortillas and other products like that. And then next we have Campbell Soup Company, which is just 7.5% of sales, not as big as those others. They have the Pepperidge Farm brand in bread, but they also are involved in Danish butter cookies. They have 6 different brands of Danish butter cookies. And the next slide. So one of the reasons these firms have so many brands, some they've introduced, but many they've acquired. So this is a timeline from 1996 to 2015, showing at the top is Grupo Bimbo, and then Flowers Foods, and at the very bottom, Campbell. And you can see how just over this period, dozens and dozens of firms were collapsed into just 3 by the end of that period. And they've continued to make acquisitions since then. The next slide. And so this is concentrated baking. So they have 70 bakeries. Bimbo has Flowers 44. But Bimbo in 2012 acquired Sara Lee, a very large bread firm, and actually shut down 18 plants. And they've only added 2 in their growth since then. So this is reducing the number of even bakeries that supply people with bread in the US. Next slide. So, but there are counter trends. There's resistance, and many of you are part of these counter trends. So I do bake my own bread, but not all the time. So I rely on my local bakery, which is called Stone Circle Bakehouse, which was established in 2009. And that's Kevin Cosgrove, who is the baker. And there are more and more efforts like this that are sometimes hard to see. The next slide. So the next segment is beer, and you saw this slide earlier, and you may notice that it looks very much like bread, with these 2 dominant firms and 4 firms controlling over half the market. But I want to point out that that bread slide was for the US market. This is global market share. So just one firm brews 29% of the beer for the entire world, which is incredible to think about because 100 years ago even, beer was a very local product. It wasn't shipped vast distances. So now we have this incredible global dominance by just a few firms. The next slide. And similar story here, growing through acquisitions. You can see many firms were collapsed into just 4. So for a while we had 4 firms headquartered in Northern Europe that were brewing most of the world's beer. And then in 2016, you may remember, incredibly, the #1 firm, AB InBev, at the top, was allowed to acquire the #2 firm, SAB Miller. So a deal of over $100 billion, regulators, which, in the US 50 years ago, they undid a merger because it would have resulted in a 4.5% national market share for the new firm. Here we have 29% of the world's beer, and regulators allowed that to happen. So next slide. So this is a graphic that shows ownership of leading beer brands in the US, and I know that's very hard to see, but I'll zoom in on the key here. Next slide. So yellow are the big brewers and also their non-craft brands. And then red is crafty or fake craft beers. So we saw in the last 20 years or so, many of these big brewers, they didn't feel threatened by craft, but they copied that strategy. They have fake craft beers like Blue Moon and Wild Hop with no indication of that corporate parent. And so that was a strategy they used for a while. And then blue represents actual craft breweries, and then the green is private equity firms. So next slide. Now zooming back out, you can see almost at a glance that nearly all of those large yellow circles, those big brewers, have acquired an actual craft beer. So you can see the sprinkling of red, those fake craft beers, but then starting in 2011, the big brewers have been buying up actual craft breweries. And I'll zoom in to the next slide so you can see some of the names in more details. Anheuser-Busch InBev, in blue are the 17 craft breweries they've acquired since 2011. And then Heineken, the #2 brewer in the world, acquired Lagunitas in California, but also has partial ownership of 7 more craft breweries. And this is, I mentioned the corporate ownership wasn't disclosed on the fake craft beers. It's not on the actual craft acquisitions either. And the next slide. So, but you might wonder, do the breweries have a commitment to the values of craft? Or is this maybe a good thing that they're, putting craft beer into more locations with better distribution? Well, in 2015, over 100 million people watched the Super Bowl, and they saw this ad that Anheuser-Busch InBev ran that just mocked craft beer drinkers. They made fun of people who smelled their beer, who drank varieties like pumpkin peach ale. The next slide. But so incredibly, this ad ran just 1 week after they acquired a West Coast brewery that makes pumpkin peach ale. So there were 3 original founders of this brewery, and one of them didn't really want to sell, but the other 2 partners made him sell. They all became executives at Anheuser-Busch InBev, but then this ad ran, and the guy who was not so happy about the acquisition resigned from InBev. He said, clearly there's no commitment to the values of craft at this corporation. So next slide. And for some consumers who aren't studying the beer industry press and figuring out who owns who, it can be a challenge on the retail shelves to figure out, am I actually supporting AB InBev's, mocking craft beer drinkers with my purchases? So a few years ago, I went to 20 different retailers in Lansing, Michigan, where I live, and I recorded the amount of shelf space taken up by all of these brands, and then decoded the ownership, and I calculated that an average retailer, about 40% of what you see in the craft beer section actually has ownership ties to these big brewers. That's something that has caused a lot of concern. And the next slide. One response is from the Brewers Association. So this represents over 9,000 breweries now in the US that account for about 13% of sales. And they introduced this independent craft label a few years ago. So anyone who's eligible to be a member of this organization can use this seal to help people quickly identify that it doesn't have ownership from a big brewer. I quibble with them a little bit because they allow up to 20% to still be considered craft. So you can have 19.5% ownership by a big brewer like Shorts, where I'm in Michigan. They're 19.5% owned by a big brewer. They could technically use this label, but as far as I know, none of them with that level of ownership actually use it. It's all 100% independent craft brewers that are using this, and there are now more than 5,000 breweries in the US using this seal. Next slide. And there are many food and beverage industries, not just bread and beer, that are being acquired by, that are interested in organic production. And then you have this takeover by big firms of those pioneering organic firms. So all those yellow circles are some of the largest food processors in North America. And all those brown circles, more than 100 of them, are organic firms that have been acquired. So I'll zoom in on a few examples here with bread in the next slide. So for bread, in the space of just a few months, Flowers Foods spent nearly $400 million to acquire 2 successful organic bread brands. And then Bimbo also acquired an organic brand through its acquisition of Canada Bread Company years ago. And more recently, just a few months ago, they acquired an organic cookie company in the US. You also have big brewers like Molson Coors, AB InBev that are acquiring firms that have some organic offerings. So again, none of these ownership ties are disclosed, so it's a similar story throughout for all these organic foods and beverages that people don't know who they're actually supporting with these purchases. So next slide. And this is a real problem because there's been a lot of dissatisfaction with the way the national USDA organic standard has gone. A few years ago, they allowed hydroponic operations to be certified as organic, which, as far as I know, no other country in the world allows. About the same time, they resisted tightening some rules around livestock that would have made it more difficult to have intensive, factory-scale livestock operations. So there are actually 2 responses to this, 2 different labels, regenerative organic certified and real organic, that take organic as a baseline, but prohibit hydroponic, require access to pasture, and have other standards so that people can find foods that actually represent more of their values that are no longer embodied in USDA organic. Next slide. So the next segment is milling, and as you know, this looks a lot different than it did 150 years ago. This was more typical then. In 1870 in the US, there were more than 22,000 mills, many of them powered by water. But after that, there was a big transformation, some new industrial processes, and very quickly it changed. The next slide. So by 1898, there was what was called a flour trust, where 3 firms, all in the Minneapolis, Minnesota area, had about 24 mills that became very dominant in flour processing. And then a lot of those smaller mills went out of business. So these, because of antitrust laws and also wheat was planted in more areas of the US later, their dominance declined a little bit. But next slide. But in the 1980s, those antitrust laws were essentially dismantled, and we very quickly saw the top 4 firms in flour milling increase their share of the market over 20% in just a few years. The next slide. So the North American Milling Association, Millers Association, says they have 48 companies that are members that represent 95% of the American industry capacity. So just 170 mills that are producing 95% of the flour in the US. And the next slide. But it's even more concentrated than that when you look at the biggest firms. So you have Ardent Mills, which controls 34% of North American milling capacity with just 40 mills. And here are their locations. Some farmers, depending on where they're located, may have no choice but to sell to Ardent Mills. There are no other options. And the next slide. So Ardent Mills is actually a joint venture. So it's made up of ConAgra Foods, which is a publicly traded firm with over 80 food brands. And then there's Cargill, which is privately held. There are 17 different billionaire families that are descendants of the founder of Cargill. And then CHS, which is technically a cooperative of farmers, but it's one of the 100 largest firms in the US. And their strategies are essentially the same as corporations. So these three firms decided, and regulators allowed for them to come together and dominate flour milling in the US. And the next slide. In second place is Archer Daniels Midland, or ADM. They have 17% of the capacity, 23 mills. So those two together control over half the market. And Archer Daniels Midland is infamous. You might remember years ago that there was an FBI wiretap investigation, and they were caught on tape conspiring to fix prices for lysine and citric acid. So they would gather their three other biggest competitors in a room and fix prices. And this actually became a Hollywood movie starring Matt Damon. But one of their slogans that was on tape repeatedly was that the customer is our enemy and the competitor is our friend. So it was just a way of life for this business to gather together with competitors and fix prices. Next slide. And one of the problems with such geographic concentration with milling, we saw in 2016, there was an outbreak of pathogenic E. coli, which was traced to this one flour mill owned by General Mills in Kansas City, Missouri. And it ended up affecting people in more than 20 states. So when something goes wrong, even if it doesn't happen very often, it can affect millions of people very quickly. Next slide. And there's a counter trend. And I'm really glad to be here and to learn more from you about all of these efforts that you're involved to counter these trends. So these are a few examples from my state of Michigan. These are stone mills, and you can see the one at the top is actually wind powered. It's a restored windmill that powers that operation. And there are more and more efforts like this. And the next slide. So the next segment is farming. And next slide. So this shows the leading wheat producers in the world by country. And then there's a map of wheat production. The darker the yellow-orange, the more wheat is planted. And you may not be able to read this. So the top producers are the European Union, then China, India, United States, Russia, Canada, Australia, Pakistan, Ukraine, Turkey. So as you know, because of war and climate change and distribution disruptions, there are more and more disruptions affecting this global wheat supply. The next slide. So zooming in, this is Europe and Asia, and you can see in Europe, wheat is planted pretty extensively. But in other parts of the world, like India and China, it's much more concentrated in particular areas. And the next slide, in the US, it's also much more concentrated in just certain areas, such as in Canada, in the southern plains. And then zooming in, next slide, on the US, this is some USDA data showing crop acreage by county. And wheat is the third most planted crop after corn and soybeans, about 55 million acres a few years ago. And you can see where it's more concentrated in certain areas. And the next slide. So there's also been a trend towards fewer and larger firms. So this orange bar shows that from 1987 to 2017, the average farm size more than doubled. And then these blue bars show the number of farms. So over that same 20-year period, the number of farms actually declined by more than 2/3. And it's gone down since. So next slide. So back in 2012, there were nearly 150,000 wheat farms. Now there are less than 100,000. But at that time, this is the data on how much wheat is produced by certain size farms. On the next slide. And just 3,000 farms were producing 22% of the harvest. So those farms of 2,000 acres or more accounted for 22% of the harvest. and then 100,000 farms of 250 acres or less were producing 11% of the harvest. But then 2/3, the majority of the harvest is coming from farms of 250 to 2,000 acres. But these are the farms that are declining the fastest, and many of them are losing their land that ends up being absorbed by these big farms, and we see fewer and larger farms. Next slide. And then the last segment I'll talk about is seeds. So all of these blue circles are seed firms, and then red circles are chemical firms. And the largest circles are proportional to seed sales. So you can see those two largest circles are in red. So the two largest seed firms in the world are chemical companies. And the four largest firms control over 60% of the entire world's proprietary seed sales. And those same four firms, over 70% of chemical sales. This is a really dramatic change from a few decades ago. The chemical firms have collapsed from 30 separate firms into just 4. They've made hundreds and hundreds of seed company acquisitions, and increasingly are tying chemical sales to the sales of those seeds. So next slide. And just as one example, before it was acquired by Bayer of Germany, Monsanto formed a holding company from 2004 to 2007 called American Seeds Incorporated, and they acquired more than 24 Midwestern corn and soybean firms. There was no disclosure at the seed dealers. You could go to the websites and find no indication that they were now owned by Monsanto. And in the years since, next slide, over 57 of those local and regional seed brands have been dismantled, including all of these. And even for the remaining ones, there are a lot fewer seed options for farmers. So next slide. But even before these trends, we saw increasing genetic uniformity in wheat. So all of these blank circles represent the approximately 30,000 different varieties of wheat. With those 9 red circles at the bottom, those are the number of varieties that are planted on about half the acreage in the US. And where I'm at in Michigan, it's just 6 that are planted on half the acreage. So next slide. But there's resistance to these trends. There are a lot of smaller seed companies that are focusing on things like seeds that are suited for organic production and better taste and better nutrition. And these are 60 that are members of something called the Open Source Seed Initiative. The next slide. The Open Source Seed Initiative is, they're developing new varieties with these traits that many people want. And they come with a pledge that says you can use these seeds any way you want as long as you don't restrict others from using them by patents or other means. So this is a way to try and challenge one of those drivers of industry consolidation, which is governments are allowing increasing intellectual property protections on seeds and making it very challenging in parts of the world to just simply exchange and save seeds. And there are similar efforts now in many other parts of the world, including Germany, India, Ethiopia, and Kenya. The next slide. So just to recap, I've talked about trends of both uniformity and diversity in the grain systems that supply us with grain in these 5 areas. And so we have this dominant trend towards uniformity, but also these counter trends that are working towards more diversity. And the next slide. And I mentioned some efforts that are trying to make those counter trends more visible. So we're going to need a lot of strategies and a lot more people in order to counter those dominant trends, to slow or even reverse them so that we have more diversity in our food systems. But I think one strategy that's really key is to help make them more visible and to prevent them from being co-opted and brought into that dominant system. So I mentioned a few examples of those. And to conclude, I'm just really hopeful that we're going to see more and more of these efforts towards more diversity. Thanks. Yeah, and not all, but many of those visuals are available at my website, which is philhoward.net.
Thanks, Phil.
Yeah, thanks.
Don't really know what to say. Probably one of the most profoundly depressing slideshows I've ever seen, but that's the reality, isn't it?